Hello, welcome to another Scheme tutorial. If you've watched my previous videos, you may notice that I've made some changes. For one thing, the font should be large enough that you'll be able to see the text without expanding the video. And I've also downloaded a neat little program called Omnidazzle, which allows me to highlight different things on the screen. Well, highlight my cursor, really, because I noticed that my cursor wasn't really showing up in very well in my previous videos. Okay, so we'll be talking about lists today. A list is a special object in Scheme which stores smaller objects or objects that you pass into it. Now, to create a list, you just need to make a list statement called a list function, and then you just start listing the different items one by one. So as you can see, it can store any of the objects that we've spoke of before, including symbols, strings, and numbers. Indeed, list can store any object that you pass into it. Okay, so there's the output of that right here. Okay, and there are a few different functions for dealing with the items of any given list. And actually, I should probably define this list as an object. Okay, so I'll just call it list1. And the first function I'm going to show you for dealing with list items is the first function. Now, as the name suggests, all the first function does is outputs the first item of the list. Now, if you want to get the rest of the items of the list, what you need to do is call a function which outputs the list, but with the first item removed. And that function is the rest function. So I'm going to pass list1 into the rest function, and we get the rest of the list. So if you want the next item of the list, if you want to output this B, for example, you just call first rest list1, and we get the B, which is at the beginning of the new list. Okay, now there are also a few functions defined to add items to lists that already exist, and one of them is the append function. Now, what append does is it takes it takes two lists as parameters. Actually, it may be able to take more than two, but we're just going to be dealing with two lists at a time. So it can it takes two lists and it appends the items of the first list that you pass it onto the front of the items in the second list you pass it to create one big list. So what we're going to do is, well, we have to define a second list containing the object that we want to append to the first list. Actually, I'll use X. And I'll call list1. So as you can see, the items in the first list or the item in the first list, I should say, was appended to the front of the original list. And if we want if we want it to be appended to the end instead, we can just switch the two parameters around. Okay, so there you have it. Now, what I'm going to do is, as you may have guessed, lists really lend themselves to recursive programming. So what I'm going to do is write a simple function which takes in a number. I'm going to call it compile list. It takes in a number, and if you want to make a comment in the code that doesn't get processed as actual code, what you need to do is just precede everything with a semicolon. Okay, so what compile list does is it takes in a number and outputs a list containing the numbers 0 to 1, or 0 to the number in increasing order. Okay, so we need the function to be able to store the unfinished list as it's being compiled, so it can output the finished list at the end. So what we're going to do is define a helper function for this. Compile list helper, and it takes in two variables, the original num as well as the list, the unfinished list. And what we're going to pass into that helper function is compile list and then the number. And it's going to start compiling it from an empty list. So we're just going to pass in empty, which is the same as an empty list. And okay, so going to do a little bit of recursive programming. We'll start with the base case. When num is equal to 0, we want to since that's going to be the end of the function, we want to append a 0 to the front of the list we've constructed, and then just output it. Okay, so append list 0 list, and if num is not equal to 0, else we want to call the function again, and for the first parameter, num is going to go down by 1, so we just pass in minus num1, num1 minus 1, and we want num to be appended to the front of the list. So we pass in append list num list. Okay, so let's just make sure that works. Compile list 5. Huh. Whoops. Yeah, it's supposed to call compile list helper. And there we have it. The numbers from 0 to 5. So that's just a simple function for compiling a list of numbers. See you next time.